Hello, welcome to this overview presentation of community-based social marketing. My name is Jennifer Tabanico, President of Action Research. As program planners who may be joining us from environmental organizations in the government or non-government sector, it's likely that you're relying on getting individuals to comply with your requests in order to achieve your environmental outcomes. And compliance with that request is essential to you achieving your goals. But what we know is that behavior change is hard, and unfortunately many program planners are not equipped with the tools they need to really drive effective behavior change. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to a model called community-based social marketing. Community-based social marketing is grounded in social science and gives you tools that you need to understand the underlying motivations and barriers that people face and drive them to long-lasting behavior change. Action Research is a firm dedicated to applying both marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. We have been applying community-based social marketing across a wide range of behaviors and have seen tremendous success across domains as diverse as waste and recycling, transportation, energy conservation, water conservation and water quality, health and safety behaviors, agriculture, and conservation-related issues, as well as pollution prevention. This is a model that has demonstrated success in changing behaviors across a wide range of domains and a wide range of audiences. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the funders, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, under an agreement to the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So the first point that I want to make today is that behavior matters. When you look at just about any environmental issue, whether it's air quality, water quality, or natural resource depletion, or species and habitat loss, almost in every case you can narrow that down to an individual action, decision, or choice that is related to that outcome. And very often, the way that we address these outcomes is through technology or infrastructure changes. So we build bike lanes, for example, or we invest in electric vehicle technology, or we come up with really great designs for rain gardens and rain barrels. But these technologies are only as good as the people who use them and use them effectively. If people don't buy electric vehicles, you don't get the greenhouse gas reductions that you're hoping for. If people move into an energy efficient home, but then they leave their windows open when the air conditioning is on, you don't get the energy reductions that you're hoping for. Or if people install rain gardens and then they don't maintain them effectively, you don't get the water retention and pollution prevention effects that they're designed for. The other way we often go about behavior change is through policy and law. We can create policies that remove fertilizers from the markets. We can create regulations that fine people for allowing water to flow off of their property and impact local waterways. But again, policies aren't a simple solution. Policies take time to get into place, and they require enforcement and regulatory resources. So even when policy and law is in place, we still need to rely on behavior to get people to comply or to get people engaged in behaviors on a voluntary basis so that they're more supportive of policies when they come into place. So this presentation, we're going to focus on encouraging voluntary behavior change. These could be anything from getting people to pick up after their pets, taking household hazardous materials to a collection center, installing low water landscaping and removing turf, and a whole range of behaviors that can impact the environmental outcomes that you're working on. The second point that I want to make is not only does behavior matter, but the behavior matters. So even within a very specific domain, like water quality, there are a wide range of actions that people could engage in. Even just within lawn and garden maintenance behaviors. There's maintaining sprinklers, there's picking up after pets that have on the lawn, there is fertilizer use, pesticide use, and a whole wide other range of activities just there. And what's really important to remember is that not only are there a diverse number of behaviors we could engage in, but the reasons that people don't engage in those behaviors differ at the level of individual actions. So the reason that someone might not take their used oil to a collection center is going to be really different than a reason that someone might not install a rain barrel, even though both are protective of the environment and people may care about the environment equally, their reasons behind not engaging in those behaviors can be very different. So I want to talk now a little bit about how behavior change has been approached traditionally by program planners. And typically it's taken one of two avenues. The first is a knowledge-based approach, and the second is an awareness-based approach. Under the knowledge-based approach, the assumption is that people don't act because they don't know what to do or they don't know that they should. And so we create flyers and brochures and websites and we hold workshops with the hope that if people just knew what to do, they would certainly take action. But what we know from the research is that simply having knowledge about how to do something or knowing about its importance is not sufficient motivation to act. The other approach that is often taken is more of an awareness-based approach. And these are efforts to educate people about the severity of the issue. And the assumption is that people don't know because they simply don't know how important it is. So we push out messages that highlight, look at all of this marine pollution and look at these birds that are impacted by single-use plastic. And we try to generate concern. But what we know from the research is that simply having heightened levels of awareness and concern or positive attitudes about an issue does not necessarily translate into behavior change. So next I want to talk to you about some research in which they've tested this assumption. This first study comes from the energy conservation space. And I chose this study because it kind of tests the upper bound of what you're probably able to do with your programs in terms of the resources dedicated to communicating with the audience. The study was done by Scott Geller at Virginia Tech, and what he did was advertise in the paper a 3-hour workshop to be held on a weekend to the first 40 people who signed up. Now, this workshop was advertised in the paper and only had limited availability. So as you can imagine, the people coming to this workshop were likely already very motivated. They're going to spend 3 hours on a weekend learning about energy conservation. The workshop was intended to educate people and heighten their awareness about energy conservation and the measures they could take in their home to save energy. Now, what he wanted to do was test, did people have increased knowledge and attitudes and awareness, and did that translate into behavior change? So when he tested knowledge and awareness before and after the workshop, he found that people were more knowledgeable about the energy conservation actions they could take within their home, and they were more aware and supportive, had more positive attitudes about energy conservation. But remember, they wanted to test, did behavior follow? So what he did is go back to these individuals, these 40 highly motivated people who came out and learned about energy conservation for 3 hours. Now ask yourself, how many of you have 3 hours to spend with your target audience? So here's what he found in evaluating the behavior results. First, only 1 out of those 40 highly motivated people lowered the hot water temperature on their hot water heater. And that's a relatively simple action to take. It's just, in most cases, a turn of the dial. So pretty depressing result there. Slightly more encouraging is the second result, that 2 out of the 40 installed a hot water heater wrap. Now that's a more time-intensive behavior. It requires going and purchasing something, going in and installing it. It takes a lot more effort. But 2 out of 40 did that, slightly more impressive, until I tell you that both of those individuals had done so before coming to the workshop. Lastly, and the most impressive finding is that 8 out of the 40, fully 20%, installed a low-flow shower head. Now that's a great action because it has the benefit of saving both water, but also energy associated with heating that water. So 8 out of the 40 did that, which again becomes less impressive when I tell you that all 40 of those highly motivated participants were given a low-flow shower head at the workshop. So even with a highly motivated audience and all of that time, there still was no behavior change despite increases in knowledge and awareness. Now this second example is a little bit more like what we typically see in campaigns, and this is the campaign done in 1991 by the National Cancer Institute, and it was focused on increasing fruit and vegetable consumption to 5 servings per day. This is a very well-known campaign, and many of you have probably seen it. It's the 5-a-day campaign. But let's take a look at the results that came out of this campaign. In the period before the campaign, about 7% of people knew that they should be eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. In the years following the campaign, that knowledge went up to 20%, a very significant increase in knowledge and awareness of the importance of eating 5 servings a day. But when we look at behavior, let's see what they found. In the years prior to the campaign, 11% reported that they actually ate 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And following the campaign, this is not a mistake on the slide, it stayed at 11%. So despite significant knowledge and awareness and increases, and also just the recognizability of this campaign, it did not necessarily translate into changes in a relatively simple behavior. And we've seen this on state and national scales as well with a number of campaigns. The Flex Your Power campaign in California focused on energy conservation is very well known, and the 10-year evaluation of that program showed no change in behavior. Similar with the 1 Ton Challenge in Canada, despite broad recognition nationally of that campaign, it was not associated with substantial changes in behavior. So why is this? Why, when it works for marketing, it works to sell soda, it works to sell cheeseburgers, it works to sell vehicles, why is it that we fail when we're trying to move people toward environmental protection behaviors? And one of the reasons is that when we're trying to sell cheeseburgers or sodas, we're shifting consumer preference. We're shifting people from drinking Coke to Pepsi, or we're shifting them from driving a Ford to a Chevy. When we're working on environmental protection behaviors, we're trying to get people to do things they're not already doing. Or we're trying to, for example, get them to not drive at all, not to buy a different car. And additionally, we're trying to get people to engage in things that are often more difficult, more costly, and more inconvenient than what they're doing already. And that takes a different approach. So that approach that we're going to talk about today is community-based social marketing. Community-based social marketing, importantly, is not a new marketing tactic. Community-based social marketing is a process that's grounded in decades of social science research about what motivates people to engage in action. Community-based social marketing is also, not surprisingly, community-based. And by that, I mean the programs that are developed out of community-based social marketing are developed based on information gathered from the community and very often delivered by the community and community organizations themselves. It is also community-based in that it makes good use of social norms and social diffusion, 2 tools we'll talk about later in this presentation. By relying on these social networks and social influences, we can really drive people towards significant behavior changes, and that's another way that community comes into play in this process. Also inherent in this process is a focus on removing barriers, and that is barriers to individual actions. What are the things that stand in the way and decrease the likelihood of engagement? And then lastly, community-based social marketing is behavior-based. Unlike many programs that are focused on knowledge and awareness, community-based social marketing is focused on behavior change as an outcome. We're less interested in counting what are the things that we did, how many people showed up to the workshop, how many people came to our website, and more interested right from the beginning, did the behavior change, and did we change a behavior that's tied to an outcome of interest. So community-based social marketing consists of 5 steps. I'm going to walk through each very quickly here, and then we'll dive in deeper over the rest of this presentation. The first step is to select a behavior, and there's a strategic process that we'll discuss around how to do that. Once the behaviors are selected, then barrier and benefit research is conducted to learn about what are the barriers that decrease the likelihood of action and what are the benefits that people perceive as a result of taking that action. Third, and only when we have conducted sufficient barrier and benefit research do we move to this third step, which is to develop strategies. Those strategies are then pilot tested on a small scale to see if they're effective, not just effective at changing behavior, but also cost effective at changing behavior before we move to the 5th step, which is broad scale implementation and evaluation. So I find it helpful now to walk through a brief case study to illustrate the full process of community-based social marketing. This case study comes out of the Clean Water Program in the city of Oceanside in Southern California, and they were focused on a particular area of the city called the San Luis Rey River Trail. The San Luis Rey River Trail sits right along the San Luis Rey River, which drains directly to the Pacific Ocean. So therefore, water quality in that river and into the receiving water Pacific Ocean is a significant concern. However, they had measured higher than normal levels of bacteria in that water and felt that this bacteria was related, at least in part, to pet waste being left along the trail. So this is what we were asked to do, and we began first by wanting to make sure, do we have a problem? Is there actually pet waste along the trail, and who is responsible? So what we did is we partnered with the Girl Scouts to go out and see, all right, who is responsible? Are these people coming from all over the city and to the trail, or are they coming from the immediate neighborhoods? Are they coming from other cities into the city to visit the trail? Who is our target audience? So we had the Girl Scouts go out and conduct in-person surveys of people with dogs, and we found out that most of the people coming to the trail with dogs were coming from the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the trail entrance points. So that gave us a very clear target audience. We also went out and had them count piles of dog waste along the trail to make sure it was actually a problem. Sometimes we perceive something to be a problem, but it's important to verify that with actual data. So we knew we had a problem, and we knew who the target audience was. If we took a look at how the city was currently addressing pet waste issues on the trail and around the city, you can see that it highlights the motivations that they thought were important. First, it's the law. You must do this because it's the law. And in fact, it transmits disease if you do not pick up after your pet, and it's going to impact the health of your children. These were the motivations that the city was pushing out in hopes that it would drive people to change. They also didn't make the behavior change look very comfortable or easily managed in terms of picking up pet waste. In fact, the gentleman in the green sign doesn't even have any equipment with which to pick up the pet waste. So we thought it was important, based on this process, to go and understand what does our target audience experience in terms of barriers and what are their motivations. So since we knew that there were people living close to the trail, we elected to do a mail survey, and we got over 50% of those residents to respond. And what we learned is that people didn't care that it was the law. In fact, they didn't believe it would be enforced. And they weren't really concerned about the reality of it transmitting disease, and not even very concerned about water quality. But their primary motivations were that it was social responsibility. If I have a dog, it's my responsibility to pick up. And the primary barriers were that they forgot a bag. If they didn't pick up after their pet, it was because they forgot a bag or because the trash cans were too far away. And in fact, the trash cans were about a mile apart on this particular trail. So knowing what our target audience needs and motivations were, it made it very easy for us to move to the next step, which is the strategy development. So we developed a strategy that focused on the social responsibility with a play on words, do your duty. But importantly, we couldn't just focus on that one side of the equation. We also had to focus on the barriers that people faced. And those barriers were not having bags and not having sufficient trash cans. So an important part of the strategy was addition of pet waste bag dispensers and also trash cans along the trail. So to pilot test this strategy, we divided both a paved and unpaved side of the trail into two sections. One section that kind of kept its existing signage and infrastructure, and then the other section that got our community-based social marketing strategies. And so then we had the Girl Scouts go back again and count piles before and after implementation. And what we found is that prior to the campaign, there was somewhat higher of a level in our test area than in the control area. But following the campaign, we saw a significant reduction in piles in our test area and no reduction of any significance in our control area. By having that control area, we can be more confident that any change that we saw was not due to seasonal variation. It wasn't because fewer people were coming out to the trail. It wasn't something else, some other message happening in the city. We can be much more confident that because we only saw change in our test group, that change is a result of the strategy that we implemented. So now I want to take a deeper dive into each of the 5 steps of community-based social marketing. So the first is selecting behaviors. Now, very often when agencies approach a behavior change program and we ask them, well, why are you focusing on that behavior? We hear answers like, well, management thinks it's important, or I have an idea for a tagline. And that turns out to be sometimes the right way to pick a behavior, because sometimes you're right. But very often when behaviors are selected in that way, we're selecting behaviors that are less important or less impactful on the outcome. So for example, within energy conservation, sometimes we want to focus on, let's get everyone to turn off the lights. However, turning off the lights happens to be one of the least impactful things that you can do in your home to save energy. Whereas something like washing clothes in cold water can be very impactful, but we pick turn off the lights because it's visible and apparent and we see it. So because of that bias, it's really important that we use a strategic process for selecting behaviors. And the first way we do that is by focusing on the desired outcome first. So at the very beginning, be asking yourself, what is it that we need to change? Do we need to change a level of erosion that is happening? Do we need to change a level of bacteria that we're measuring in the water or a level of a particular chemical that we're seeing? What is the outcome at the end that we need to change? Second, what are the sectors or the audiences that are connected to that outcome? Is it agriculture? Is it residents? Is it tourists? Who is connected to the problem? If you pick the wrong audience, then there's a disconnect between the action and the outcome. Once you've defined the audiences that are most significantly related to the outcome, then we need to ask ourselves, is the behavior that we want to target linked to that outcome? Does engaging in this behavior or not engaging in this behavior actually connect to what we're going to measure at the end? So once we have defined outcomes and audiences, we create a long list of behaviors that could potentially be related to that outcome. And sometimes that list can be very, very long, and sometimes it's only a few behaviors. But it's always good to start with defining these ahead of time. Importantly, those behaviors should be defined as non-divisible. And by non-divisible, I mean that those behaviors cannot be broken down into smaller actions. So for example, something like properly dispose of household hazardous waste is divisible because the way that you properly dispose of paint is different than the way you dispose of used motor oil, which may be different than the way you dispose of batteries, and so on. So defining those as individual actions is very important. Similarly, prevent habitat loss encompasses a wide range of actions that people could engage in related to particular species or areas. So again, defining those as non-divisible actions is where we start. Second, in defining that behavior list, it's important to not focus on strategies. So things like attend a workshop or sign a pledge. Those are actions that you hope will motivate people to engage in a behavior, but they are not behaviors by themselves, as they are not things that cause a change in the outcome. Once you have a long list of behaviors, you may need to prioritize, because what we know is that people, when faced with too many decisions, are likely to do nothing. So if we give people a list of 100 things that they can do to protect water quality, for example, the assumption is, well, if we give them 100 things, they will do something. But what we know is that if we give them 100 things, they are less likely to do anything, or they're going to pick those things that are really easy and less impactful. So when we're faced with a long list of behaviors, we need to take efforts to prioritize those. And one way that we do that is by looking at 4 different factors simultaneously. First, we want to look at impact. That is, which of these behaviors, or how much of an impact, how significant is that behavior for a particular outcome? We want behaviors that have a high degree of impact. The second factor that we look at is probability. So even though we want behaviors with a high level of impact, we also want to pick behaviors that have a high level of likelihood that people will engage in it. Otherwise, if we don't move anybody, then the impact doesn't matter. So we're looking for high impact, but we're also looking for high levels of probability. Third, we look at penetration. Penetration is the extent to which people are already doing the right thing. So we're looking for behaviors that have low rates of penetration. That is, there's room to move people. If most people are already doing the right thing, even if the behavior is impactful, there's not many people left to move. So again, we're looking for behaviors that are high impact, high probability of engagement, and low in terms of their penetration, current levels of penetration. And then lastly, the other factor we look at is applicability, and that is, for whom is this behavior change relevant? So take, for example, rain barrels. if you want to promote rain barrels in a particular community, that behavior is only going to be relevant for people who actually have gutters and systems installed that they could actually have a rain barrel on their property or benefit from that particular behavior. So again, we're looking for high impact, high probability, low penetration, and high rates of applicability. And we look at all of these in combination to help us make strategic choices about which behaviors to move forward with. The other intricacy I want to mention regarding defining behaviors is an idea called behavior chains. And what we've learned from applying community-based social marketing across a wide range of behaviors is that sometimes the behavior is not as simple as turning off the lights, which is just a one-step action. Very often, what we're referring to as a behavior is made up of a series of sub-actions, each of which has their own barriers associated with it. So think about riding your bike to work. You first have to have a bike, and then you have to make sure that bike is in good repair, and then you need to know where to ride it, and so on and so on. There are many steps that you need to engage in before you actually are riding your bike to work. Similarly, with household hazardous waste, we can just walk through a very simple behavior chain here. First, you have to have an intent. I need to know, oh, I have household hazardous waste of some type. Maybe it's used motor oil. I have to identify what are the materials that I have. I need to figure out where is the collection center that I need to take it to? What are the hours of operation? Do I need to put the material in any special container in order to transport it? And if so, I need to obtain that packaging. Next, I've got to actually put it in the car and pack it up, transport it to the collection center at the appropriate time. Then upon arriving to a collection center, I may need to learn the operation procedures of where things go and how to interact or what fees to pay or not based on the operations and procedures. And then we've round up to successful drop-off. So you can see by breaking down a process like this that behavior change could stop at very different levels. So first, people have to be motivated. We can start there. But if they cannot get transport because of limitations of their vehicle or access, then they're not going to make it to the successful drop-off. Or if they can't find the collection center details, or maybe the collection centers have hours that are limited, they're not going to make it further down the chain. So breaking down these behavior chains can really help you to identify where people are falling out and what new barriers might be at play. So moving on now to the second step in community-based social marketing, which is identifying barriers and benefits. Essentially, barriers are why people are not engaging in a particular behavior. And those barriers can be internal to the individual. It can be lack of concern, misunderstanding, lack of knowledge, just general apathy, a feeling that they might be perceived as strange or weird if they engage in a particular behavior. Those things are internal barriers to the individual. But barriers can also be external to the individual. They can be high costs of particular items. It could be access to contractors, limited hours of operation, or other program complexities that the individual doesn't have control over. So with community-based social marketing, we want to understand both the internal and external barriers. It's also important to remember that these barriers, though I mentioned earlier that they can vary by behavior, so people's reasons for not engaging can be different based on very specific actions. But barriers can also vary by audience. More elderly, senior audience might experience different barriers than young families to engaging in particular behaviors. Barriers can also vary by season. Somebody might be a really great job of engaging in backyard composting until winter comes along. Or maybe they're really great at riding their bike until the season changes. And again, barriers can vary over time as well as new products come into the market and new trends come into the market. That can really, and new policies and laws can really change barriers that people experience. So because of that, it's also important to be strategic about the way that you are evaluating barriers and benefits. So the way we do this is first by starting with literature reviews. Always good at a starting point to see what others have done already. What do we know from other agencies, other regions, other audiences about what prevents people from engaging in this behavior? That can be followed up with observations, actually observing people in particular environments, maybe how their behaviors are, managing dogs in beach areas. You can really learn a lot about the barriers that people face by observing. And focus groups is also a good way to understand the range of barriers that people might experience. These 3 qualitative efforts can then be followed up with more quantitative surveys to see what is the extent to which those barriers exist in your population. And in further trainings that may dive deeper into these particular topics. So here we're just providing you an overview of the methods you might consider for exploring barriers and benefits. The most important thing to take away from this presentation, however, is that your research on barriers and benefits should never be based on hunches about what we think people are experiencing. Because as program planners that are working in the environmental sector, the things that we perceive are often very different, and the things that are important to us are often very different than the target population. And so it's very important to get out of the office, out of the conference room and planning boardrooms, and talk with members of the target audience. If time is limited or budget is limited, what we recommend is always to do that literature review, start with what someone else has done already, and then move out of the office and do a few intercept interviews. And you can ask 2 simple questions of people. 1, what makes it difficult or challenging for you to engage in X? And 2, what do you see as beneficial or rewarding about engaging in X? And just asking those 2 questions of members of your target audience can significantly increase the likelihood that your strategies will be successful. So moving on now to the 3rd step, only when we've done our barrier and benefit research do we move to strategy development. So I'll talk just generally about how we go about developing strategies that make use of the barrier and benefit research that we've collected and also social science tools. So first, we look at both barriers and motivation, but of the 2, most important is enhancing motivation. People have to have a motivation to act, otherwise the barriers don't matter because there's no movement forward. So in the next slide then, we can illustrate that with a graphic. So if you think about the barriers as being a wall that you hit, and the wavy lines there on the left being motivation or drive toward that goal. People are generally driving toward the goal, and then they hit that barrier wall. So one way to achieve behavior change would be to lower the barrier wall so that existing level of motivation sails right over. Or another way would be to enhance motivation so that it's enough to get over that barrier wall. But the best approach is what you see in the bottom of the slide here, and that is to do both. If we simultaneously increase motivation and bring down the barrier wall, we can more effectively get to our behavior change goals. The 3rd element that we want to consider in developing strategies is personal contact. What we know from literature and communications is that while information and awareness campaigns that use traditional mass media like TV, radio, billboards, these campaigns can reach a lot of people. And we get a lot of impressions. A lot of people are exposed to the campaign messages. But we also know that behavior change associated with those kinds of communications tend to be very low. On the other side of that, we know that individual conversations that we have one-on-one with people don't reach a lot of people in quite the same masses, but have a greater impact on behavior change. So if you ask yourself about the last movie that you watched or the last book that you read, it's more than likely that you made that decision based on a conversation or interaction you had with a friend, colleague, or close other, and not necessarily because you just saw the trailer on television or you heard a radio announcement. So the closer we can get to one-on-one communication, the more likely we are to be successful. And that doesn't have to be program staff knocking on doors. It can be retail partnerships where when people purchase particular products, they're having conversations at the point of sale. It can be block leaders, neighbor to neighbor, work groups, and there's many other ways to get closer to personal contact. And lastly, and where we'll spend most of the rest of this presentation, is we draw on tools from the social sciences in developing our strategies. So I've divided the strategy tools into 2 sections. The first section focuses on their tools that are focused on removing barriers, and that is education, convenience, and prompts. Even though at the beginning of this this training, we talked about education as not effective by itself to motivate behavior change, lack of knowledge can be a barrier, and that is a time when you need to use education as part of your campaign. 2 other times to use education are if it's a new program or behavior. Maybe it's a new regulatory requirement. And then lastly, if there's a change to an existing program. So maybe household hazardous waste facility no longer accepts a particular type of material, or maybe they accept a new type of material. So that's another type of situation where you may want to use education. So on this next slide, here's just an example of a simple communication showing what items can be taken to a household hazardous waste facility and what the hours of operation are. The other tool that we can use to address barriers is convenience. Anytime you can make a behavior easier for people to do, you increase the likelihood that they will engage in it. So making the desired behavior easier across the board is going to drive success. But we also want to think about ways that we can make the undesired behavior harder for people to do. And sometimes we forget about that side of the equation, right? So we build bike lanes to make it easier for people to ride their bikes, but how can we simultaneously make it harder for people to drive their cars? Lastly, another way that we can make behavior more convenient is by reducing the steps. And so thinking back to mapping out those behavior chains, are there ways that you can cluster together some of those steps for people so that they more effectively move through that behavior chain? So here's an example of some work done with hikers in trying to prevent the spread of invasive species. Rather than have hikers have to buy a brush to clean off their shoes before and after hiking, remember to bring that brush to the trail and actually use it, many trails have installed stations that hikers can use immediately right at the trailheads to clean off their shoes prior to hiking and after hiking, again to prevent the spread of spores from one location to another. Another way to make things more convenient, another example here, is increasing the presence of trash cans. So as you can see, you see one here, but they're also spread out throughout. And we know from research on litter that the more infrastructure that's available in terms of getting people to do the right thing, the more likely they are to use the trash cans instead of littering. And the last tool I want to talk about in terms of removing barriers is prompts. Prompts are tempting to use because they typically take the form of stickers or magnets or keychains or various reminders, and they're generally pretty easy to develop. But prompts are really only appropriate if the barrier, that is the reason that people aren't engaged in the behavior, is because they're forgetting to do it. And then, in those cases, having a visual or auditory reminder, a text message, a refrigerator magnet, many other forms of prompts, having that reminder can increase the likelihood that people will engage in it. But again, only when the reason that they're not engaging is that they're forgetting. People don't forget to buy an electric vehicle. People don't forget to replace their turf with drought-tolerant landscaping. But people might forget to purchase fertilizers that are safe for aquatics, or people might forget to check their sprinklers and make sure they're not broken and running water into the street. So your barrier and benefit research will highlight whether this is an appropriate tool or not. When it comes to prompts, there are some best practices. Number one, prompts are best for repetitive actions because the idea is that you remind people a few times, and over time it will become a habit for them and they will no longer need to be reminded. Again, prompts are not generally effective for one-time purchases, for example, but more appropriate for those things that we're doing on a repetitive basis. When using prompts, they should be placed as close in space and time to where the behavior is going to occur as possible. So having reminders inside a grocery store to bring your reusable bags are unlikely to be effective because once you're inside the store, it's too late. Those reminders need to be kind of back at the vehicle or even better at home where you're remembering to put the bags in your car. And lastly, prompts should emphasize the correct action. So rather than on focusing on what not to do, like don't litter, don't over-fertilize, we need to let people know what to do. And those prompts should be very clear in emphasizing that particular positive action. Couple examples here. Here's an example from the County of San Diego's Watershed Protection Program, reminding owners of large properties to pick up after their pets in areas of those properties that are susceptible to runoff. Here's another example that's very well known from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, reminding people at the point that they're out to eat or to make a food choice purchase a seafood purchase, what seafood choices are appropriate in their particular region. This is now available as an app, but the idea is that it's available close in space and time to where people need to be reminded. Here's another example from the County of San Diego where residents were reminded to check their sprinklers at a time that they were already out and about in their lawns. So what the barrier and benefit research identified here was that people were watering their lawns in the middle of the night or very early in the morning and weren't aware that sprinklers were broken. However, they were mowing their lawn on a fairly regular basis. So this prompt here was placed on the lawnmower, reminding people to check their sprinklers while they were mowing their grass. So they're already doing that, to turn on their sprinklers and check for any leaks at that time. This next set of tools focus on enhancing motivation, and those are commitment, social norms, and social diffusion. There are many more tools in our toolbox, but I chose these three because they are the most commonly used and the strongest tools that we have, because they very much rely on self-perception and perceptions of the community and our peers. So the first tool I want to talk about is commitment. Commitment is based on Daryl Bem's theory of self-perception. And the idea is that when you make a commitment to do something, it changes the way you see yourself. And then your future actions are more likely to fall in line with that commitment you made. In addition, consistency is seen as an important character trait. We want our actions to be in line with the things that we say we're going to do, and if they're not, we feel discomfort, and we know that we'll be judged in that way for that inconsistency. Because commitments do rely on self-perception, I'm the kind of person who cares about the environment or who engages in this behavior. Because it relies on self-perception, commitment generally only works for an audience that is already motivated to engage in the behavior, but are experiencing a range of barriers. When it comes to commitments, we also know quite a bit about how they can be more or less effective. And a recent meta-analysis has pointed to 3 particular ways in which commitments are most effective. First, it appears that commitments are most effective if they're written rather than made verbally. Second, if commitments are made public rather than in private, and in fact, if they're posted publicly, such as a kiosk in a particular employer, up on a sign at a park, in an entryway, somewhere where other people can see that you've committed to this action. And then lastly, we want commitments to be durable. We want them to be long-lasting so that they're there as a reminder of what you committed to. So commitments made on social media very often are not durable because that commitment is made and then it very quickly goes down to the bottom of a news feed. But having your photo posted in a kiosk at the entryway to a state park could be a very durable commitment. So thinking about how you can make commitments written, public, and durable will be more effective. Here's a few examples. Here's a commitment reminding people, well, it was a commitment and a reminder, getting people to turn off their computers and monitors at the end of the workday. This was a business card size placed in the lower left-hand corner of the monitor, and it was filled in as a pledge to turn off both the computer and monitor. Here's an example from the Oregon Coast Aquarium where children made commitments for how they were going to spend time outdoors. Here's another commitment. This one's focused on pet waste, where dog owners signed a commitment to pick up after their pets while on walks. Those commitments were posted at events. This board traveled around to every event. And then the individual dog owner was also given a commitment to put on a pet waste bag dispenser that was attached to their dog leash. So as a reminder of their commitment. Here's a pledge form that was signed. This was part of some work with the California Integrated Waste Management Board, now CalRecycle, aimed at increasing the rates of used oil recycling and filter recycling. Participants signed this pledge. This pledge was posted at the store and also placed around a funnel so that when people were changing their own oil, they were reminded of their commitment. So take a minute and look at this photo and ask yourself, if you walked into Jamba Juice or Starbucks or your local coffee shop or whatever organization you visit, which of these 2 jars might you be more likely to tip? Now intuitively we might think the jar on the left because this person surely needs tips. But what I can tell you is if that I watched 100 people enter this situation, most of the time the tips are going to go into the jar on the right. And more than that, not only are more tips going to go into the jar on the right, they're more likely to be dollar bills and not change. And this is a phenomenon which is called social norms, which is the next tool we're going to talk about. And essentially, social norms are our tendency to look to others, to other people and outside of ourselves in determining how we should act. And this is particularly true if the situation is ambiguous, people aren't sure what to do. We look to others to guide our own actions. And we do that because some of the time we're right, but we know this to be a very influential tool, and there's decades of research on this topic. Because it is such an influential tool, this is a tool that can be used when existing levels of motivation are low. In some research done in the energy and water utilities, we know that social norms are most effective with some of the highest users. So it's influential on people who aren't already trying to do the right thing. Because social norms are so powerful, it's really important that when we use social norms communications, we highlight the desired behaviors. That is, we want to hire what other people are doing that is right. Otherwise, we can get into a situation where we have boomerang effects. And there's many examples of campaigns that have inadvertently highlighted the masses of people doing the wrong thing. But what we know is that people go with the group, even if the group is not necessarily doing the wrong thing. So here's an example. This is Tony Hawk, a famous skater, Southern California, but I think nationally known. This is an example of how not to do a social norms communication, because the idea is, well, everybody's littering, you shouldn't. And even though we think that that should work because it's heightening awareness, oh, I shouldn't do that because everybody else is, what it actually does is has the opposite effect. Again, people go with the group, even if the group is not doing the right thing. Better examples of how to use social norms are through testimonials. So quotes and interactions from people who are engaged in the behavior can be very impactful at moving people to action. Also presenting data in terms of the high proportions of people engaged in a particular behavior. Here's an example of how commitments can be clustered together in order to convey a social norm. So here, do-it-yourself oil changers signed a large poster at an event with their names that they've committed to recycling their used oil and filters. Those commitments clustered together conveys other people think this is important and other people are doing this, which is a social norm. Really another interesting way that we can combine some of the tools that we've talked about. So when you're developing the strategies, it's helpful to look at what are your barriers and what are the tools that we're going to use and how can we combine them into a single instrument. So here's an example of a program that used a pledge combined with a commitment combined with a social norm, or a prompt, I'm sorry. So the prompt was a reminder for people to turn off their computer monitor and CPU at the end of the day. Something that we learned in the barrier and benefit research was a primary reason. So we have a prompt placed in the lower left-hand corner, but that prompt is also a commitment. So they've got a public commitment made written, posted on their monitor. Now, if you think about a workplace setting where these commitments are posted on everybody's computer, that then becomes a social norm. So you have prompt, commitment, and social norm all in one, addressing both barriers and motivation. The last tool I want to talk about is social diffusion. Social diffusion goes back very long to the 1940s and changing agricultural practices. So this is a tool that we've had in our toolbox for a very long time. Essentially, social diffusion is the way that new activities, new behaviors, or innovations diffuse through social networks, through our friends, neighbors, colleagues, family members, coworkers, the people with whom we have conversations. Social diffusion happens through conversations with others who are engaged in those new behaviors or by those new innovations. Because of that, one of the primary best practices for using social diffusion is to use it when the behavior is visible. So something like installing a rain garden or installing a rain barrel is very visible out in the community and invites others to engage in conversation about that. Whereas other actions inside of the home, the products that you use, are less public. So this is best for visible behaviors. And the way we go about doing that is we get commitments from early adopters. Likely in your audience, even if the behavior you're asking them to engage in is very difficult or maybe new, not everybody's doing it yet, it's likely that you have some people that are willing to take on those. You have some champions. So engaging those early adopters, having them make commitments to engage in behaviors and then talk to other people is how you get social diffusion into place. Importantly, that social modeling should be done by individuals who are well known, but should also be well respected. And those aren't always the same thing. There are people who can be well known, but not well respected. And you can also be well respected and not well known. So finding people through your barrier and benefit research and your foundational work, finding those people who are well known and well respected and engaging them in those behaviors, they are connected to people and their opinions are respected. So here's an example of work from the University of Tennessee where farmers were asked to use an industrial byproduct on their fields as a soil amendment. And this product was essentially gypsum, but it came from a process in a fossil fuel power plant. So of course there was reluctance to use it. However, we were able to get some well-known, well-respected farms in the community to try this gypsum on a small portion of their land, take photos of how the crops did, and then share that back through community meetings at local restaurants with other farmers in the area. So that's an example of how you might use social diffusion. Here's another example from the city of Encinitas in California, where it focused on a small community and trying to get people to install drip irrigation. And we identified who in the community, and this community was the one that everyone looks to. Who's always planting the coolest plants, who always has the greatest gardening tips. And that person bubbled right to the top through that research. And so we hosted at that person's home a demonstration of how to install and manage drip irrigation on the property. So that allowed people to not only overcome some barriers they had about knowledge, but also to engage in discussions with one another about participating in this particular behavior. So we've talked about all these tools for enhancing motivation and removing barriers. But remember that our programs are typically one in many other programs that people are exposed to across many other topics, from health and environment, public safety, financial planning, and so on. So we can't forget that this effective communication is an important part of our planning efforts. If people don't pay attention to our message, they don't hear it, they don't see it, they don't attenuate to it, then all of that other stuff doesn't matter. So a few of the ways that we can make sure our messages are relevant to people is, one, making them personalized. The more personal you can make a message, whether it's tailored to their particular context, it's addressed to them, the more likely people are to pay attention to it than those that are more broad. Making use of vivid communications, particularly when describing technical topics, but placing things in terms that are tangible to people. So if you're talking about bacteria measurements in a waterway, how can you translate that into something that people can actually see and understand? And then lastly, talking about local impacts. How does this impact my watershed, my neighborhood, my local wildlife, and not so much global impacts that are more distant? These are all ways that you can get your message through to people and speaking to them in the values that resonate with them. So thinking back to the case study we talked about earlier in this presentation, focused on picking up after pets, where the city's primary motivations were it's the law and it harms water quality. The individual's primary motivation was social responsibility. I want to be perceived as a responsible dog owner. So when we communicate out to our audiences, it's really important to remember that sometimes the reason for delivering the program is not the audience's reason for engaging in the behavior. Once we have developed a strategy or strategies that we think have effectively removed barriers and enhanced motivation, it is important to pilot test these on a small scale before broad scale implementation. By pilot testing, I don't mean run the program for a year and see what happens. Pilot testing is typically done on a small scale over a few weeks, a few months, depending on the behavior. It allows us to identify and address problems up front. Maybe it's public reaction, we can refine our strategies. Or maybe we don't effectively overcome a particular barrier and we can refine our strategies. It also allows us to test several variations of the program because we want to find behavior change, but we also want to do that in a cost-effective manner. So this would allow you to test different variations of a strategy, maybe one that has a higher cost because it has an incentive component or it has more in-person staff time associated with the delivery. We can test to see, are they equally effective, or is the less expensive program just slightly less effective than the more expensive program. It allows you to make really good choices about your return on investment. Pilot testing is often skipped, but in the long run, it's a cost savings. It takes a relatively short amount of time, and the value in understanding whether your program works and the cost effectiveness of delivering that program, and really saving your agency from delivering a program that's not effective, because the return on investment for a program that doesn't change behavior is zero. And pilot testing will allow you to address those concerns right before you've implemented broadly. So here's a graphic that kind of shows the feedback loop built into community-based social marketing. The first feedback loop comes at the area where you're doing barrier and benefit research. If you conduct barrier and benefit research with your audience and you learn that the barriers are simply too great to overcome with the resources of your program, then you need to go back and pick another behavior. Because if you're not going to be able to effectively address political barriers, financial barriers, or other programmatic barriers that are preventing people from engaging, there's no sense moving forward and trying to enhance motivation. But you can go back and select a different behavior. The second feedback loop comes in at pilot testing. If you pilot test a strategy and it doesn't work, you can go back and revisit those strategies and ask yourself, did you effectively address all of the barriers that were identified? And the third doesn't happen very often, but if you've pilot tested ad nauseum and you're still not getting behavior change, you may have to go back and pick a different behavior that maybe has a less of an impact, but you can actually affect change. The final step in community-based social marketing is implementation and evaluation. We should only get to this step once you've identified through pilot testing strategies that are effective. When implementing and broadly evaluating, it's important that whatever version of the program you pilot tested, that's what you need to be broadly implementing. And sometimes where agencies go wrong is they put a lot of resources into pilot testing. Maybe they have media events and they involve the governor or the mayor, but then when they go roll it out, they do a diluted, scaled back version of the program. We can't expect the same success unless what you broadly implement is what you pilot tested. So thank you for your time on this webinar. I hope you learned a bit in this introduction to community-based social marketing. Here there are some additional resources that you may choose to explore to expand your education around this topic. I've listed them here, as well as some books that for extended reading and case studies on this topic.